Welcome to Derailed Trains of Thought. So, welcome to episode 16 of Derailed Trains of Thought, your one and only storytelling podcast. This is Nick Hayden, aka Andrew the Wanderer.
And this is Timothy Deal, aka the Klaus.
Klaus?
The Klaus, yes.
Okay.
That's my dwarf from role playing.
Oh, okay.
One that I'm quite fond of. He was a wanderer, and he had and he was a little slow in the head, but he had traveled to so many places that he couldn't quite remember which accent was his normal one. So he tended to alternate between them.
Nice, I like that. That works pretty well.
Yours sounded vaguely role-playing related.
Well, no, it was just, it's the name I used to write poetry under, like epic poetry.
Oh,
and then it
okay.
became the person who would write poetry in, like, Strand Fred.
Okay, nice.
For a long time, names I invented in high school would transfer in different forms over and over again, like Fred Militia, who's one of the main characters of Strand Fred. I used to use for, like, every sentence in vocab when we needed to write, a sentence for the word, conflagration. It'd be like, Fred Milish started the conflagration.
Nice. It's always fun when you could recycle old ideas like that.
So.
And you have a penchant for using interesting narrators that have their own stories. And
I enjoy differing narration styles. One of these times we're going to have a topic on styles.
Yeah.
But we're not today, so we'll go on to story school. So, today's story school was actually suggested to us quite a while ago.
Several months, actually. I don't remember. Greg was the one who suggested that we talk about this.
The fancy name is participatory stories. Basically, any sort of story, like a video game, that you're part of the story, part of the action.
Under that category, you can include video games. You can include choose your own adventures.
Yeah.
You can also include interactive fiction.
Yep, which I'll probably end up talking about here. Maybe I'll mention it real quick, give a definition.
Yeah, because some people may not really understand what that is.
Interactive fiction, I guess, was like the way to play computer games back in like the 80s when everyone had DOS, or not even DOS, Infocom and other such things. But it's basically a text adventure where you read a paragraph and you say you want to go north or south or eat the bread or take the wine or
get ye flask.
Get ye flask. Yeah, if you've ever been to strong homestarrunner.com, they make fun of those games. I hear that one of my 8th grade students was telling me that, I don't remember which of the modern first-person shooters, Medal of Honor, or one of those, you can actually play the entire game of Zork inside of it. Zork being one of these really famous early interactive fictions.
And that's like embedded in a first-person shooter game?
Yeah, like in some computer you do the special code or something, you can play it.
That's awesome.
Because I think Zork inspired a lot of people at the time. It's one of these, I have never played it, where you go down and it's just a whole kingdom and you explore and try to find treasure. And most interactive fiction in its conception was largely exploring. They were like the game Myst, but without pictures.
Where Myst was mostly pictures.
Myst was mostly pictures. But it came up with this, the guy who the guy who kind of reintroduced interactive fiction to the internet community says that interactive fiction is basically a crossword puzzle battling against the narrative. And I guess I have the idea that these participatory stories, video games, choose your own adventures, are perhaps not pure narrative, but really are narrative versus some other thing.
That's an interesting concept. And you certainly get the sense sometimes in commentators talking about, sometimes when someone complains that a movie was too much like a video game, then what they're saying is there was too much flashiness, too much, spectacle just for the sake of spectacle and not enough heart or meat to the story. But that's an interesting perspective. I'm not sure, I can certainly see that being sometimes the case, but I don't know that it necessarily is always the case or that it has to always be the case.
And I guess I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. That's the narrative versus a
puzzle.
A puzzle. You know, Professor Layton and I talked about couple episodes ago. Basically, puzzle games, and every once in a while there'd be a story, and sometimes the puzzle's connected, sometimes they're just not. It's like you do the puzzles so that you can reveal the next part of the story. And I think a lot of video games are set up that way, where I gotta get through this dungeon in order so I can discover the next part of the plot. That they're not necessarily. I mean, I haven't played a lot of really modern games, and they work more and more on trying to meld the two. But I think, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's just part of the beast that your story is not the only thing you're telling.
Well, yeah, and that's a fair point. Any type of participatory story is going to have another feature in it because it's not. You're right. It's not a straight up narrative. Even a choose your own adventure book, you're flipping through pages. You've got a certain kind of construct there that isn't necessarily a narrative construct. It's more of a functional construct. So I guess that's a fair point.
What do you think is the advantage to telling a story in one of these media?
Well, one thing is that it can really pull your audience into the story. They have a vested interest. In a sense, by like say a video game, by taking on the character that you see on the screen, go through it, you become invested in that character in a way that you might not in just a movie. Watching a movie to a certain extent is a passive experience. You just see what he does and you go so forth. In order to progress in a video game, you have to actively be taking a part in the story. You want your character to succeed because in a sense you are that character.
Yeah, I'm gonna play devil's advocate here.
Oh, go for it.
Say one of these stories that many video game players love, just because I'm not in modern, like Final Fantasy 6 or 7.
Uh-huh.
Say you did that as a movie or a television series where you had the time. Do you think it'd be as good?
That's an interesting question because we have talked about doing a Final Fantasy 6 series, which I think would be pretty cool.
I mean, I'm just curious. Is you lose and again, Super Nintendo games maybe don't count because the graphics so pixelated, and that's
and because the like Super Nintendo graphics are so understated, it's kind of like that whole abstract thing where you get to project a lot of your own ideas onto it.
That's true. Which actually, I think one reason why 6 works so well because you have that. There's these there's like little tiny block characters, but between Nobuo Uematsu's music and just reading into things, it can really work.
And I know some people really prefer the old school Final Fantasy stuff because they don't like the look of the Japanese animation characters that they like when they make it the way that their culture would do it, and then some people don't like it as much. Which I'm not sure is fair, but
but it happens.
Yeah.
So I guess this question stands. So you lose some of that ability to interpret, but what do you gain then if you would make, say, Final Fantasy VI into a really well done? The story's held just as highly or done just as well.
Well, one thing you would gain, I suppose, in the adaptation is that you would make it all a lot tighter. You could take out some of the just wandering and killing monsters and stuff, which is fair enough. That's more gameplay. That's the puzzle part.
Yeah, exactly.
On the reverse end of that, you're also by tightening everything. That also means you've got less of time investment, which can be good and bad. I mean, you can play a video game for 20 to 40 to 60 to 80 hours, depending on what game it is. And that's a lot of entertainment value for your money.
Yeah.
But a movie is only 2 hours and then you're done.
That's true.
Which some people, that's all the time they can afford to put in a thing. But other ones, like, this is an investment. I get to be with these characters that I've grown to love for a very long time.
Part of the reason I'm thinking on this whole line, which I think I kind of blindsided you with, is because I heard this interview with Doug TeNapel, who I had never heard of before. But apparently he's the creator of Earthworm Jim. Who I've never played the game, but I guess it got in the Smithsonian, I guess.
Oh, really?
They were entering some video games, and
I know a lot of people like the music from it.
Yeah.
And Doug TeNapel has done a lot of graphic novels, right?
Yeah, and that's what he does now. And anyways, in this interview, he mentioned that he got out of the video game business partly because he didn't feel like he could tell the story he wanted to in video games. That he felt like, to paraphrase, you had to kind of cater to the game. That's not exactly what he said. I might be taking out of context. But it made me think about that. Because I remember, I've been fascinated with interactive fiction, this text-based thing I talked about. Partly because it's a programming language to make, and I like that sort of thing also.
we've established before, Nick is one of these really weird people that likes writing and creativity stuff, but also math, which
Yeah,
kind of blows my mind.
I'm kind of bizarre that way. It was interesting. I keep wanting to write one, but I can't come up with a plot to go with one without massive amounts of programming experience. Partly because all the stories I want to tell involve some sort of important component of internal conflict change, which does not lend itself well to this sort of crossword puzzle nature of you can do it and people have. I mean, I'm not good enough yet because I haven't worked myself up, but I do think sometimes the stories I want to tell are hard to do in those media because of the sort of I create more character based stories and less plot based stories, and plot based stories I think are easier in these sort of interactive stories.
Definitely easier, I agree. And like you said, it's not like you can't do a character exploration because Final Fantasy probably has done a lot of that kind of stuff.
And I know there's some modern games. I just read an article are trying to let your characters make moral choices in the middle, and different things happen
to varying amounts of success, I think.
Well, yeah, because the problem with making moral choices in a game is that you know it's a game.
Yeah.
And part of you, at least maybe not all people, for me, I'll be like, well, what happens if I pick this one? It's the same thing as choosing your adventure. You're like, you know, some choices are horrible. You're like, well, I'm going to try it anyways. We can just back up and try again.
Which is an odd part about these participatory stories because you can purposely go down a very evil path. I mean, if you're given moral choices, like you could decide, well, just to see what would happen, maybe I will slaughter this person, this innocent civilian, and
since you know it's also a game, you want to see what are the game consequences.
Yeah.
As opposed to what's the, you know, when if in life you were said, hey, you're going to kill this guy, most people would be like, are you kidding me? No way.
Yeah.
and I think that's an interesting dimension of these interactive stories that I'm not sure, you know, for people who are trying to talk about choices in them, I'm not sure anyone's going to approach your choice in the same way they would in real life.
Which, again, that kind of takes away a little bit from the narrative aspect of it. And it may be, to a certain extent, may be part of what keeps some people from enjoying it. I mean, we talked earlier about it being people wanting a passive experience when they watch a movie or something, or, you know, they just want to sit back and relax. I remember one of the first Choose Your Own Adventure books I ever read, where I took one path and your character wound up getting arrested. And I'm like 10 years old at the time, and to me, I felt very bad about this. Like, I'm a good person. That shouldn't happen. Why would I get arrested? But it made me uncomfortable.
Incidentally, only vaguely related, I just have to give a shout. If anyone's ever read The Lone Wolf Choose Your Own Adventures, they were awesome.
Oh yeah.
They were role-playing game Choose Your Own Adventure. We had hit points and weapons.
Oh really?
Yeah, very very cool. You can find them for free online now.
Okay.
But anyways, I had to throw that out there. But I remember I bought one. And I thought it was the coolest thing in the whole world, and I desperately want to go back to the bookstore and buy like 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I don't think I ever did, and I was very sad. And for years, I was like, oh, remember that book I played once, which is interesting. Not that book I read.
Right. But it's a very different format. I know sometimes, especially since you had talked to me all about this interactive fiction thing, and sometimes I'd go check out, because there are a lot of interactive fiction things online, or choose your own adventure things, which is kind of easy to do now. What with hyperlinks and stuff, you just click it and it goes to the next thing. But I never really made it very far in one because it was like, if I want to read a story, I'll just read a book. If I want to play a game, I'm going to play something that a lot more people have played so I can talk to them about it.
Yeah, the thing with interactive fiction, I think, is the same thing that appeals to me, like when I play Myst. Have you played Myst?
I've dabbled a little bit in it, but I didn't get very far.
I was fascinated with that game. And obviously, like everyone in the planet was fascinated with the game when it came out.
Yeah.
But I really think interactive fiction and a lot of these, the ones that work really, well, I won't say a lot nowadays, but there's a sense of exploration that you play it in order to see what happens next. What can I get in here next? What happens when I beat this boss? What happens when I blow up this airport?
So and it's kind of a multi-layered what will happen next. You read a book, you want to see what happens next to the characters. So you have that in the game, plus the opportunity to get more fake loot and stuff.
Exactly.
There's a completion.
There's this Flash game called Achievement Unlocked, and the entire point of the game is to unlock as many achievements as possible. I mean, it's a ridiculous game, and the achievements are things like first time you jump, and first time you die, and first time you looked at the menu.
I remember seeing a Flash game like that. I don't know if it was the same one, but because
it's oddly addictive because you're like, oh, I'm going to get them all, and there's like 500.
Well, and this one that I remember, like you basically just push one button the entire time. It's like buy the potion, push the space bar. Good job, and then push space bar to exit the store. Push space bar to attack the monster. Good job. Push space bar to
which is, I mean, they're mocking it, but at the same time, they're kind of the one I played was kind of addictive because you do want to check the things off your list.
Mm-hmm.
There's certain sort of narratives where that doesn't work as well with because they're much more internal, ambiguous, literary, to use it. I'm not sure if that's the proper word. I mean, not that you can't do it. I mean, I'm not one of those people that I think video games are art. I'm not trying to necessarily downplay that part of it. Well, I think the interesting thing, the freedom you get in a game, simultaneously loosens up the narrative. Like the more freedom you have, the less, from an author's point of view, the less direction you have over the narrative. If that makes any sense.
No, that makes sense. I mean.
And I'm talking from an author's point of view as opposed to spectators, because I'm one of these people who play games. I don't want like 10 endings because then I want to go get them all. I want to hear the story the author wanted to give me.
Well, what about Chrono Trigger though?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, the thing with that though, you play it through and then you don't have to necessarily. You can be at different points. That's slightly different to me. Okay, I mean, granted. Yeah, I mean, I still would rather not, but I guess there's ways to do it well. There's exceptions to every rule.
Yeah, but no, do have a good point. I mean, when people talk about Grand Theft Auto, they talk about the world exploring and being able to do everything one. The giant sandbox idea. There is a narrative, but no one really talks about that. I mean, maybe some people do.
Well, it's like SimCity, The Sims, whatever. They're completely sandbox, but they don't even pretend to put a plot.
That's true.
Because the whole point of sandbox is that there is no plot.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there is this kind of pendulum between, on the rails, which some video games players don't like. I hear Xeno Saga. Some of those games are like
lots and lots of very long
like 20-minute cutscenes, which though as a game player you don't like, but if you're going for the story, you might enjoy.
Yeah.
To more sandbox style where there is no. Or not much of a plot.
And then you've got things like platformers, Mario and whatever, that there's a plot in the instruction manual at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excuse for a game at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Have you ever heard or played of Shadow of the Colossus?
Yes, and now I ran it one time and played it for a couple days and was fascinated with it. Fabulous game.
I've been wanting to try it for a while. I really would like to, because if you've not heard of it, I guess it has... You're basically on a horse and you're riding around this countryside slaying monsters. Yeah,
the idea is that
But they're all like giant monsters. It's not like Final Fantasy where you run into a monster every 2 minutes.
No, I think the entire game is like 10 bosses and that's it.
Yeah, which is a really fascinating concept.
And I thought, first time I heard about it, who was it? It was the Into the Score podcast is when I first heard about it, which is a great podcast if you've never gone listen to it.
All about video game music.
What's his catchphrase? The only podcast
solely dedicated to the academic study of video game music.
And he does a really good job. I'm not sure he's updated much lately.
No.
But anyways...
Besides, our podcast is better.
Yeah, exactly. But when I was playing it, really, the idea is that there's these, 10 idols, I think it's 10, that are keeping this princess asleep. And so you have to go kill the physical representation. And there's just this giant, beautiful, Celtic-type world to wander around in. And at first, when I heard about it, I thought, well, wouldn't you just get bored wandering around? But it's a gorgeous place. There's, you got to figure out how to get up mountains. And, I mean, there's still that sort of puzzling out how to get to out-of-the-way places. And there's, it's not a compass, but there's something that tells you where the next person is.
Well, that sounds like a game where the exploration is key.
The exploration is key. And these monsters they're just 20 times your size. And you climb up them and you have to attack certain points. And it's a really, really well done game. I only got through probably about 3 or 4 of the guides. But
and from what I understand, there is a story that kind of emerges through it.
Through everyone. I mean, it's not a real complicated story, but I think it's a very emotional, because the atmosphere is so well done, you get even as far as I got kind of this more and more ominous sense the farther they got on.
Hmm.
So the plot was half like this sense of what's happening
Uh,
to your main character.
and that's something I think video games are only just discovering this, but I think that's something where participatory fiction can create something that a normal story couldn't. In this kind of slow exploration, as you're exploring this virtual world, then a story emerges from the details.
And I think that's why Mist worked actually. I mean, because it was this very foggy, very mysterious, and every once in a while I get these pages where one of the brothers would talk, and you're like, they seem half crazy, and you're like, what's going, and then you figure out there's this whole kind of background story, which is tangentially connected to yours. I
Uh-huh.
actually read one of the books too. They came out with a couple novels. It was pretty interesting.
Portal is kind of like that too, which it's remarkable because it starts off as a puzzle game. I mean, it really is in a sense. You're trapped in this scientific facility, and you're the experiment, and you've got this portal gun that lets you shoot interdimensional portal that you go in one, you come out another one on a different wall or whatever. But as you keep exploring the game, there's this computer voice that talks to you, and you eventually find out that this computer has pretty much taken over the entire laboratory and has done all who knows what to the people who used to work there and gone crazy. But it's a really funny. It's got a really like funny sense of humor, but it's also kind of ominous at the same time. It's a really cool way of finding out a story.
I do think telling story through surroundings and atmosphere is a place where video games can work really strongly because you're immersed in the location. I mean, that's where you spend all your time. So if you have hints as you go along, little signs or things breaking down. I hear Anchorhead, which is an interactive fictional text, which is done in kind of the Lovecraftian horror style. I guess is really well done and very creepy to play, even if you're just reading it
Really.
because you're interacting and the way the descriptions change as you're walking around and
Hmm.
stuff like that. I've only heard good things about that. I have not had a chance to play it. There was one called Sunset Over Savannah. It would tell you your emotional state, and you were like on this weekend trip, and you weren't sure you wanted to stay at your job. You'd walk around. There'd be these scenes, and it's just on this beach, and there'd be little puzzles, but they'd be like these flights of fancy almost, and then it made you work through your uncertainty with your life through these incidents that happened to you while you're there, and also very good playing with. But I really do think surrounding it with the setting and the plot and the pacing and the music, if you put them all together, it can work really well because it's that immersive aspect. So
Hmm.
you've like, I've gone from like one end to the other today.
Yeah. And if you do it well, I mean, sometimes you can hide. I don't know if this is something that should be advocated or not, but because of the atmospheric aspect of it, you sort of hide some of like maybe some of the pitfalls of your story. I mean, Final Fantasy has been telling the same kind of stories. Well, Square's been telling the same sort of stories between Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts for very a lot of
Yeah.
years now. Friendship is your power. And stuff like that. But because the characters are fun and the music is usually pretty awesome, and the setting is always very cool, you don't mind.
When people say a movie is like a video game, they're saying it's bad because it's too much about mindless action.
Hmm.
And when people say video games are too much like a movie, it's because you don't have enough freedom.
That's a good point.
Find that balance between freedom and narrative, and I think they're getting much better at combining the two, having this sense
Blurring them.
blurring them and having change, things that don't feel so, not the telltale signs to say, oh, and this is your next stage,
Yeah,
sort of thing.
and
Which is not bad because that's just convention that we're used to.
yeah, oh yeah, definitely. Honestly, video games really are in a pretty early stage of their development. They've really only been around for about around 30 years or so.
Yeah.
Think about how long film has had to develop its art stage. If you look at really early cinema, I mean, it's very people did things that just because they didn't know better.
Hmm.
The idea of you could cut. You don't have to show every single thing in the scene, a character walking. You could just say, "Okay, we're leaving," and then cut to them go at the other place, and audiences would understand. Didn't even realize that at first.
Be like when they first started messing with montage, that was a big deal, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah, and it took a long time for. I mean, that was the Russian filmmakers were the first ones to really get into montage, and then it took quite a while for Hollywood to embrace that kind of stuff because they were always afraid the audience was going to get confused.
Those dumb audiences, they can't follow anything. So I'm not sure where we end up on all that. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I had kind of this dilemma. I wanted to write in high school. My friend and I were going to make this role-playing game in the style of Final Fantasy. That was like the only game I played back when I was young, called Twilight Dawn. And I was writing the script, and he was going to do all the programming. He's now like doing artificial intelligence somewhere.
Wow.
I think that's what I heard.
If you're listening to this, Nick's friend, please let us know.
And like an interview with you.
Let us know when we get back to this game.
But it was fun writing the script for it, and what I found really exciting was being able to write the random townspeople, writing good stuff for it. Because sometimes you can play the role-playing game, it's like, hi, welcome to this town, or man, isn't a nice day out. Completely unhelpful, like you just want to make the town feel like it's not deserted sort of stuff. But there's another place where you can lay a lot of clues and groundwork and relationships.
That's true.
Impressions.
I just started playing Final Fantasy XII relatively recently, and you start off in this pretty big city. There are a lot of townspeople, and of course you feel like you have to talk to every single one of them. But you get a really good feeling for the world that you're in, sometimes more than the rapid speed cutscenes will have time for it.
Exactly. But because we never got programmed, I started writing things in that world in a normal, short story format. And I really like that. I'm almost don't know if I want to go back to the...
Because it's been so long since you tried to plan it the other way.
Partly that, and you can get so much... As an author, you have so much more control in a narrative. Mm-hmm. In a normal, paper narrative. About what the people see, what they don't see, what's important. Simple things like in a role-playing game. Well, what I like about a role-playing game, you can just travel and it's all monsters. You don't have to worry about it. Downside in the book, then you have to explain how they got there, and either just cut or do Tolkien-esque traveling scene, which is kind of a pain. That's the downside to the paper narrative. But there's just you can play with you're talking about like interesting narrators. The narrators of Twilight Dawn is an interesting kind of first-person omnipotent historian, I guess. I like words a lot, and you can have a lot of fun with that. Simultaneously, video games are really cool too. So the downsides and upsides are kind of hard to explain. I think for the reader, but I think for the artist, sometimes you can find you just don't have as much say in a video game.
Yeah, it is
depth-wise, I guess, into the character.
Yeah, probably if you have a particular story that you really want to tell, specifically a video game or participatory fiction, is maybe not the best way to do it. But it is certainly an interesting. I mean, I've tried my hand at with limited success. I tried to do a choose your own adventure long time ago, just with linking Word documents together. And the problem was I didn't get very far because there was only one way I really wanted to go.
Yeah, exactly. That's like, the hard part.
Yeah, and who wants to write the other parts?
Because you want to make it in such a way that, well, if I was writing it, that all the parts would be interesting, but there's only one story you want to tell. I mean, at least that's how I'm built. Some people are built where...
No, I totally understand. One time I ran my own campaign in role-playing as far as, pencil, paper, D&D kind of roll of dice role-playing. I had a lot of fun with it because I had this very complicated conspiracy that was going on behind the scenes, which was fun to do and sick on the players who were playing it, because all their characters, and they didn't know what was actually happening, all this stuff. At the same time, it was a little tricky to make sure. I mean, they were a very compliant set of players, not like sometimes you get these groups that purposely try to run off the rails and try to just do whatever they want to do. Thankfully, my gaming group wasn't quite like that, but I still had to make room for them to, different paths they could follow or different doors or whatnot.
Speaking of different paths, I once read this academic, I don't know if it was a paper, on Choose Your Own Adventure books. Talk about a number of endings, especially, from the beginning to the, the first one to the later ones and how many paths and all this stuff. And there was one book, apparently, where there was a page that you could not get to unless you just randomly looked through the book to find it. That there was no linking thing to it.
Oh, really?
That it was like this utopian island, like everything was perfect. But you could only get to it by purposely going through and
just
flipping
through it.
Which was playing with how people sometimes do those books.
That's really funny.
I can't remember what the name of that one was called, but I thought that was fascinating because they were playing within how they knew people consumed the Choose Your Own Adventure books. But you eventually go like, have it got all the endings?
Well, that's like a video game where they put the most obscure ways you can possibly get the super duper weapon.
Yep.
That you'd have to buy the the walkthrough guide or something.
No one in the right mind would figure out how to do it.
Yeah. So they play with that stuff.
So participatory stories, video games, interactive fiction, others. I'm sure they come up with other things.
Yeah.
Virtual reality.
And people who are really into the D&D role playing stuff, there are some groups that really enjoy telling a story through that way.
Which is one I guess we haven't talked about much in this case, but would join in.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess there's a lot of immersive possibilities, and sometimes at the expense of an artist's single vision, which may or may not be a bad thing.
Yeah.
So go play your favorite video game and enjoy that someone had to figure out why the characters did what they did.
And if you've always been kind of so on the whole gaming thing, try to think about it a little differently.
Go play Shadow Colossus.
there's more thought there than you might think.
In some of them.
Certainly more than
in most of them.
Now, if you listen to this and go play Pac-Man, you're probably going to be disappointed, but...
Pac-Man's awesome. I mean,
think about the symbolism of those ghosts. Well, aren't we all running from death?
No, if you see Mrs. Pac-Man, it's the story of a love story. You ever see how they met and how they met? I mean,
is there actually a game about that?
No, Mrs. Pac-Man, like we beat the first 3 levels, and then they shows how they meet, and beat the next 3 levels, and then they do something else.
Okay, see, I've
only beat 6 levels, so I don't know.
I didn't play Mrs. Pac-Man as much as Mr. I don't think.
So, go play Mrs. Pac-Man and rave to us about... beat it and tell us the complete story of how they met and had kids and lived a long, fulfilling life and left all their money to a charity when they died.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing about that.
All right, so that is our story school. And so next up after Pac-Man is our soundtrack.
What's going on? What's going on? What's going on?
For its soundtrack today, I decided to go with another song remixed from Super Mario RPG. We've done one of these not too long ago, actually, but one of the first video games I ever played purposefully to hear what the story was about. So this is Gino's Woods remix from Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Stars, as remixed by Orky Bash. Enjoy.
Right, and our next segment is going to be Cinema Selections with Brian Scherschel. Brian and I decided to do something a little different. If you've been listening to this podcast very long at all, you've heard us harass Tim for never having watched The Neverending Story. So he wrote on Facebook that he had finally finished it, so we decided that our Cinema Selections would not talk about some very worthy classic movie, but instead we will tackle the never-ending story.
Yeah.
And actually works really well. Brian, I don't know if you know, our topic this time is participatory stories, and Bastian is kind of intimately involved in the story he's reading.
He is. He becomes very emotionally involved.
Exactly. So I figured this would be a good sidetrack from what we normally tackle. Next time we'll get to Metropolis or something
Definitely.
like
I really enjoy 80s humor.
that. All
But
right.
especially one that I think is, I would say, a new classic.
Well, Tim, first off, how about you... We'll start with Tim, and I have not heard what he thought of the movie.
Yes, I'm really interested since everybody else watched it so much earlier on and you get a different perspective.
Yeah, that's true. And it probably is fair to call it a new classic because it seems like a lot of people who I said I had never seen it, they're like, what? How can that be? And I was not fond of 80s fantasy when I was
Well,
growing
you saw
up.
David Bowie in tights.
that was scarred. That was scarred just about any kid. But I don't think that's why. Movies generally kind of scared me as general rule. I think Honey, I Shrunk the Kids gave me nightmares.
Really?
Yeah, but I grew out of that, thankfully. Was probably missing a little something from not seeing it as a kid or 20 years ago. I certainly enjoyed it. Don't get me wrong, I certainly enjoyed it. But there was part of me that was like, Jim Henson's puppets were better. And there was a time or two, I don't normally notice effects, but there was a time or two, it's like, oh, there's the green screen. But I really did love the final explanation for what the fantasy world was. I love the whole idea of that it's a single place. It's like Neverland. It's a place where all your dreams and imagination take reality. And I love the idea of nothing about it being kind of related to a modern cynical viewpoint of imagination dying almost. I thought that was very cool.
I just view this movie as a series of almost emotional snapshots with a obvious really big connection in between them. There's so many poignant moments. I think what makes this a different film from the other 80s fantasies is it is a foreign film, technically. You did see that, right?
Yeah, it was Germanly produced, or produced in German. Germany.
Germanly produced.
It actually is Germanly produced because there are a lot of German cinematic effects that I think, especially if you're a kid, but even now, if you're like 30 or any other age, I think it pulls you in.
Mm-hmm. The clouds seem to be a very prominent feature of that. The clouds that represented the opening credits.
Symbolism. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of symbolism in Neverending Story.
Well, why don't you give us some of the background? I'm sure you've got some stuff there.
Neverending Story was, at its time, the most expensive film ever produced in Germany. Well, have any of you read the book?
I've read the book, yeah, and it was a massively popular book in Germany.
Yes, it was, and basically the film ends halfway through the book.
Yeah, and the second movie is loosely based on the second half.
Okay, yeah, that's a good system. But I was under the impression that they kind of ran out of money, and that's maybe why it stopped where it did. I'm not really sure because, yeah, Tim, you mentioned the green screen, and that's a really important thing because you do have the green screen where he's riding on Falcor, the luck dragon, and there's the process shot behind him, but you still have to create the dragon. And that's the real problem here. You have to spend a whole bunch of money making that kind of are like Jim Henson's world, but trying to create that from scratch, essentially, is not all that easy.
No, you can definitely tell they didn't really spare any expenses in this movie. That was very...
It's very Jurassic Park. Spared no
Yes.
expense.
It literally is, and that's one of my big points with this movie is they did spare no expense on a lot of it. German expressionism, a lot of it was about showing the viewer the fringe of dark human experience, and I think Neverending Story does that. It takes you to the nothing. What's more dark than that? That's a really big concept for, I think, a kid to look
non-existence,
at.
yeah.
Non-existence, and where's the energy from the nothing come from? What energy feeds it and makes it bigger and greater?
Unbelief.
It's kind of dying of dreams and stuff.
Right, and hopelessness. People who are hopeless, and
yeah,
that's what feeds the nothing. And it's people who have given up on their dreams and people who are hopeless, essentially. And that's an interesting concept for young viewers to understand.
They certainly weren't pulling their punches for the kids. They were letting them deal with some pretty deep issues, philosophical stuff.
Yes, and that's where we get back to German expressionism again, because the imagery is vivid, and at times the imagery is scary, even. Specifically, Gmork, the wolf,
Oh, yeah.
who was summoned by the Nothing to kill Atreyu. That scared me a lot when I was little.
But why is Fantasia dying then?
Because people have begun to lose their hopes and forget their dreams. So the Nothing grows stronger.
What is the Nothing?
It's the emptiness that's left. It is like a despair, destroying this world. And I have been trying to help it.
But why?
Because people who have no hopes are easy to control. And whoever has the control has the power.
Brian, can you talk to us a little more about German expression? How has it influenced Hollywood, and what are some of the most well-known examples of it?
A lot of this started during the period right after World War One, and that was when the Weimar Republic film industry and the German film industry reached their peak. The filmmakers of the German film company that was called Universum AG, they developed their own style by using symbolism, and that would add a mood and deeper meaning. And that's really what gets me with Neverending Story is there's so much deeper meaning that it's multi-leveled. And it also, German expressionism, like I said before, it's all about concentrating on the dark fringes of human experience, which that's also a Neverending Story. There's a lot of that. Fantasia basically almost ends, which is like, like the world ending. I mean, it's a pretty big amount of weighty subject matter. Some of the best examples of German expressionism include Nosferatu, which is a film from 1922 and is directed by the German expressionist film director F.W. Murnau. And it's the story of Dracula, and is possibly I think the best Dracula that's out there. It's vivid and is really not shocking, but powerful imagery that is really symbolic and stylized. Another one would definitely be Fritz Lang's Metropolis, and that's from 1927.
What do you think we should do next?
And that's, yes.
I've read a little bit, I haven't seen it yet, unfortunately, but I've Fritz Lang's movie M.
Yes, I've seen that too.
Is that another example?
From 1930 or 31. It is German expressionism in that it's more about working within the frame, and that was one of the things that I talked about in the Notorious sidetrack, was you have the camera sit there and you have the action take place within the frame, and you don't do all that much moving. But M it's a crime story, essentially, and there's a lot of tension that builds up in between people and groups of people. I think it's a little different from Metropolis or from, say, Nosferatu.
Okay.
It's still in the same vein, though. M's really different. I think it's just because of the subject matter.
Okay.
Come on, boy. What's the matter? I understand. It's too difficult for you. Artax! You're sinking! Come on! Turn around! You have to now! Come on! Artax! Fight against the sadness, Artax! Artax, please. You're letting the sadness of the swamps get to you. You have to try. You have to care.
Yeah, I cry every time.
Aw,
That just-
poor horse.
That's strong symbolism too, because it's showing him emote as it's all happening. Like he's experiencing it, and therefore we do vicariously through him. That's a tough one. It shows fear a lot. Like it shows people's fear and what could happen to them. For instance, the childlike empress, where she's pleading and to do something, and just
I was always fascinated with the childlike empress. I always thought that was a very intriguing. I don't know, it's something. Well, I then stole it from a book.
I was
largely.
wondering about that if it got
Oh yeah, I stole it.
in Stern Fred, except your Empress was much more bratty.
Well, yeah, and it was Neverending Story matched with Shadow Moon, which is a novel sequel to Willow.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
well, that's interesting.
the princess the baby they save
Uh-huh.
in Willow gets she grows up and she's just a horrible, wretched brat.
Wow, that's
Yeah,
ironic.
that's about the best part of that book. I don't remember it being very good, actually.
But
I'm
and
sorry.
another moment though I remember of, it's like, wow, this is really emotional. When you see the rock biter the second time, and he's like, they were big hands. I was trying to keep them safe in my hands. And you're like, oh man, that really it was heavy.
A lot of people remember that one too.
I believe it.
They look like big, good, strong hands, don't they? I always thought that's what they were. Oh, my little friends. The little man with his racing snail, the nighthawk, even the stupid bat. I couldn't hold on to them. The nothing pulled them right out of my hands.
It is a very vivid movie. I mean, a lot of the images stick with you, and maybe that's some of the German expressionism, and some that's the emotion.
It's a string of really strong emotional snapshots that create a movie, but that's what it is. It kind of goes from one to the next, and it's probably even with a regular amount of interval of time, relatively close, I mean, but it does it often enough where you really feel a lot.
You're right. I guess I never really noticed that, but it really is punctuated by, Bastian being beat up, and then the intense loneliness he kind of had at the beginning. And then,
the moment where he gets angry and he throws the book.
Yeah.
And that's really
is
strong,
that
too.
when is that when Atreyu sees?
When he looks through the mirror and sees Bastian? Yeah.
Yeah. Is that when he gets all angry?
I think it is, yeah.
That's a very interesting scene all around. And I mean, and that's straight from the book. I mean, the version I read of the book was fascinating because they would have one color text for the story about Bastian, another color text for what Bastian was reading.
Oh, that's cool.
The line between fantasy and reality, which is blurred by the end of this novel, or end of this movie, gets blurred even more in the book because at the Empress, to kind of convince Bastian, goes to this person who's recording all the events of Fantasia, which Bastian's reading. So, like, the Empress, who's in the book the fount of all the fantasy, is going to the person who writes it all in stone and makes it. And so it's almost where what Bastian reading, what you're reading, what the Empress is saying are all right on top of each other. It's a really intriguing...
Simultaneously?
Oh, well, almost. I don't remember exactly how it's done, but it's a very kind of mind-bending bit in the thing. And the movie does that to a certain extent at the end where he yells and then...
Well, and that it was a very interesting thing coming from my perspective because not knowing enough about it, I thought it was going to be a Wizard of Oz sort of thing. I thought a kid reading the book was going to get sucked into it. Like, I thought that was the main focus of the movie. I didn't know, because I had seen somewhere the image of him riding on the luck dragon.
Okay.
And so I figured at some point these stories were going to connect, but I thought it was going to be throughout the whole thing. So instead, when he's just reading and keeps reading, it's like, okay, where is this going? It was very intriguing, and that's one reason why when the two stories start interconnecting, it's like, whoa, that's cool.
Yes, it's really original. There aren't very many movies that are participatory, like this at least, like a fantasy story.
Not
that I
Not too many.
can think of. I mean, you have plenty of movies like, reading opens adventure or whatever, but not one that does it in such a visceral manner.
Mm-hmm.
Grabs the character and story by the throat, and honestly tries to grab us by the throat.
It does.
I remember, because I watched it when I was a kid. I remember in 8th grade, you probably remember this, Brian. You and I went to the same school.
Mm-hmm.
One of our friends always being like, "It is a racing snail." There's so many little quotes like that.
Yes, and the big strong hands. I think I saw a movie that somebody echoed and referred to that line.
So did this movie do well in Germany and also in the United States?
It didn't seem to.
One of those movies that kind of just was good after it came out.
Well, it opened to good reviews. It grossed $20 million, and the budget of the film was $27 million.
Oh, so it didn't even make its money back.
No, not quite. I think it did now. I mean, it obviously has by now, but Time Bandits and Dark Crystal, they both grossed more than $40 million. So that's some of the context.
That is interesting, because I read a little bit about that on Wikipedia, and that is interesting, because I had long been under the assumption that Dark Crystal hadn't done as well because of Never Ending Story, but I think I got that mixed up with Labyrinth, which I think was largely overshadowed by E.T., which came out close to the same time.
Oh, well, Labyrinth would be overshadowed by E.T.
Yeah.
What would it be?
Yeah. But I think, to be fair, I think even if Dark Crystal was more successful at the box office, I think it seems to me that Never Ending Story has remained more prominent in the public's eye. At least I've heard more people talk about it.
What I'm reading here, too, is it says, however, when released on video, the movie became one of the highest-selling videos ever released and has also become a staple on Christmas Day television.
Oh.
Interesting.
So it seems like it gained momentum throughout, and a lot of people still know it today.
It's funny how some movies are like that. I think Wizard of Oz was very similar. It became more famous once it was released on TV. I could be wrong. I forget.
Well, I think from the same reasons that we've been talking about, kind of, it's a lot of emotional hooks. It's a unique way of looking at the storytelling. It's a very unique world, like a lot of 80s fantasy is.
It's very visual and very vivid.
And that it holds up over time better. I mean, I'll get, some of the special effects, don't hold quite as well, but I think they hold pretty well for being, 30 years old or something like that?
Well, plus, honestly, I like that it's animatronics puppetry. I think, you wouldn't have the same feel for, say, the Rockbiter if he was, CG.
No, I
No.
prefer, yeah, I agree with you there.
There's a certain kind of feeling, and I really love the scene where he was introduced to. I mean, it was the whole I forget what it's called. What's the term I'm looking for, Brian? Where you've got the Rockbiter was filmed to be really big, but then they stick it on top of the same film where the other cast is filmed to be really small.
Superimposed?
Yeah, I think that's superimposing. And because I study film and stuff like this, I know that's what they're doing. But it really worked well for that scene.
It did. And the other characters that were along in that introduction scene, we see so little of them throughout this whole movie. But you can tell even their costumes were spared no expense.
Yeah.
And everything else. I mean, we see them again a little bit at a time throughout the movie, but not all that much.
Mm-hmm.
That is an interesting tactic, to introduce the whole world with basically random people.
Essentially. And then introducing Fantasia by just seeing what's left of it.
That's true. I mean, it does kind of break any of normal fantasy conventions. I mean, if you're going to follow the structures.
And what's also remarkable, now I'm thinking about it, is how massive they created Fantasia. I mean, you see all kinds of landscapes, but you can totally believe it's all part of the same world.
You do. It's really seamless how it connects things together. You don't really notice. You just accept it as all part of one uniform universe.
So are there any other movies that have such a unique and big world? Especially in Kidland? I mean, not big, but, very multivariate in a very short amount of time.
And at least this high-minded as well. There are a lot of really weighty principles about aspirations and realizing your dreams and hope. And
then the whole, Bastian's whole, disconnect from his dad and loss of his mother. I mean, which is basically not talked about, but it hangs over the whole movie, especially by the end.
Very true. There was actually, I think it was a Godzilla movie, of all things that I saw, and the way that they inserted the main character's feelings about her mother was they just showed a picture, of her sitting, a framed picture on a desk, and it just shows that, and that's all we do. Therefore, she's dead, she's not around, that's all that there is, and yet it gives you so much. And with this, there's only that one small little scene at the beginning where he's with his father, and then the bully scene quickly overtakes that.
But the whole mother thing's, vital for the end of the...
It is. It comes right back around from the beginning.
Yeah. And it really holds up much better than the second. You probably haven't seen the second one, have you?
No, I haven't.
Second one, entertaining, but not at the same level.
Mm-hmm.
By any means. Brian, have you ever seen the third?
I haven't.
Okay, I haven't either.
I've heard it's pretty wretched.
Yeah, I think at that point they're just making sequels because everyone knows about Neverending Story.
Right, and then 2014 is the tentative release for when they're supposed to be rebooting this franchise.
Really?
Huh.
Yeah, where they're going to go and supposedly re-examine the novel instead of trying to remake this film.
Who's in charge of that? I'm a little scared now.
Warner Brothers, the Kennedy Marshall Company, and Leonardo DiCaprio's Appian Way are in the early stages of rebooting the franchise and readapting the novel.
Okay. Leonardo DiCaprio has his own company? I didn't know that.
I'd assumed he would.
Well, interesting. I guess I'll wait with fear and trembling for that.
Yeah, so there aren't very many years that this will be the primary version left.
Well, possibly. Did you ever hear of that movie? It's another weird 80s fantasy movie, but did you ever hear of Return to Oz?
Yes, I've seen it
I saw
once.
it a long time ago.
I've not seen it. I've seen pictures of it, and I know it's supposed to be a sequel to Wizard of Oz, probably closer to the actual books, maybe. But it looks so bizarre compared to the original musical. I don't know that.
I think it's pretty dark,
really
too.
different.
Yeah, I don't think it was as embraced as much.
Obviously, no one's watched it now.
So it's a risk, but I'm sure people will go see it.
Oh yeah, I'll have to see it. Well, unless it just looks wretched, it's like all. Here, the thing is, what they need to do is not like so many movies nowadays want to overplay the parental problems. Neverending Story is not one you should do that. I mean, obviously it's there, like it is in this first movie, but you don't want to make it a giant,
It is subtle, and the subtlety works for the story.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of subtle things going on in Neverending Story, which is why, despite it being kind of what you remember visually are, the giant turtle and the big luck dragon and the ivory tower.
Mm-hmm. Giant turtle kind of made me think of The Last Airbender, by the way.
Well, that's true.
The Southern Oracle, where he has to jump across that gives me goosebumps every time. That part of the movie.
with the eyes from the
that's very
things.
vivid.
Yeah. You're right. They really do. And is the German expressionism, I guess, which I never knew. Really building up each of those moments. They really build up that right before he jumps.
Yes,
quite a bit. They play out each of those.
They stretch it out, and that's part of the experience of the movie. How it grabs you.
Yeah, the horse takes forever to die.
Yes, that one's bad. They really got me there.
In the finale where he's like, I can't, you must, I
Yes.
can't, so you must.
That's true. I didn't know anything about German expression. Well, that puts a whole new light on it. So, Brian, how about you give us, in case there's some poor person listening to this who's never seen Neverending Story, how about you sell it to us?
There's probably someone else out there like me.
Undoubtedly, not everybody's seen Neverending Story yet. It's kind of a mission, maybe, for those who have to force people like you to see it.
Of course, the most disappointing thing about it ended.
That is, they could have made this into a 3-hour movie easily, considering all that they had to work with. They could have spent twice as much money and made this
book's
really long
book's very
feature.
long.
Yeah, I bet it is.
It's like 400 pages. So I've had other people read it. I love the book, but they're like, it never ended. So, can you sell it to anyone who may not have, or maybe just to someone who has seen it to go and rewatch it, seeing that it's more than just maybe the cool kid movie they saw when they were 8?
Neverending Story is a poignant series of emotional snapshots that pulls you in and deeply affects you and makes you think about life and really strong subjects that you really didn't think were going to happen. It's all about realizing your self-potential.
Wow, that was not... Man.
I'm impressed.
Good for off the cuff there. That'll wrap up our cinema selection.
Thanks a lot, Brian, and thanks for sending me a copy and finally getting me to watch this long overdue movie.
Incidentally, this is my favorite 80s fantasy film, by far.
that was Cinema Selections with Brian Churchill. A special edition brought to you by Atreyu and Bastion. and
the special occasion of...
And Falcor. Yeah.
No, that was fun.
Well, yeah, it was fun to do something a little lighter. But it is, I mean, there actually is a good deal in it that when you're a kid you don't necessarily notice. And I'm glad you enjoyed it because I didn't know how much of it was nostalgia.
Yeah.
You know, some of those movies you watch when you're a kid, you're like, oh, yeah. And then you watch it again, you're like, oh, yeah.
I was thinking on my way over here about how much sometimes a certain movie, after you watch it as a kid or even as an adult, you'll just sit and think about it for a while, and then you'll have the same images impressed very deeply on your brain for a long time afterwards.
And I think that's a movie that will do the very visual impressions on your mind.
I still have this memory of watching the Chipmunks movie and about feeling very, very sad in a certain part, and because I remember just thinking about that part as I was driving back home after visiting grandma's or something. I must have been like 6 at the time.
I still remember nothing else but the end of the DuckTales movie. You remember the DuckTales movie?
Yeah. I had
Which
the
was
DuckTales movie for a while.
Which did it way earlier than Aladdin did.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the same ending.
You know, I think DuckTales movie didn't do very well, and I really wish it had, because I think they had been wanting to do a Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers movie, too.
Oh, nice.
Which, man, I can't even imagine what that would be like.
So sometime in Take on Tales, we'll have to talk. I'll have you watch Puss in Boots Travels Around the World, which is my earliest childhood memory.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. So we'll wrap up this episode. Brian, you're not Brian, you're Tim. Tim, would you like to give us some contact info?
Sure, absolutely. You can always leave us the comments at derailedtrainsofthought.blogspot.com. You can also download our episodes there. But today in the comments section, our question for you is...
What is a favorite story you've participated in? Maybe a video game, role-playing game.
Interactive fiction.
Yeah, I'd like to hear, what other ones, obviously... I grew up playing Final Fantasies, and a lot of people did, but I know there's a lot of other very good ones out there.
Yeah. Nick and I are not the most prolific gamers. I mean...
There's much more out there than I've ever touched with a 10-foot pole.
Not that you wouldn't, just...
Well, yeah.
The trick is, gaming...
It takes time.
It does take time, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah, and did you tell...
We didn't talk about the email address.
I thought you were going to complete it. Sorry.
No.
So our email address is derailedtrains@gmail.com. Still, no one has emailed us, so we're very sad.
We haven't actually finalized the prize yet.
Well,
we'll give you a hug.
A tribble.
Please. You know the trouble with triples.
There is a trouble with tribbles. It's true. And please subscribe to us on iTunes.
Mm-hmm.
And
which is, in as much as anything, is a way for us to know how many people are listening.
And please share it with other people on Facebook, on Twitter, and what other various things you want to follow or share it with. Because I think people, when they hear it, enjoy it.
Yeah.
We have some interesting things coming up. So there might be a preview at the end, so you can get through my kind of dark soundtrack. So I guess I'll go ahead and introduce my soundtrack, which is... I thought first-person shooters, early on were the ones trying to put you in the place of the person, of the character of the game. And I haven't played many, but back in good old modem dial-up days, it would be like, ding, 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 ding. And then you knew you were connected to the internet. I used to play Doom 2 with a couple of friends and had a lot of fun. We downloaded some WADs. We used to try to make some WADs, which, were the Doom levels. I played one in the Death Star, which was kind of cool.
Oh, nice.
But a lot of great remixes from Doom. And I picked this one called Crushing Headache by the Orilicon. I should probably double check this how you say it.
I didn't know you were such a violent person, Nick.
Playing
bloody Doom.
Well, you know what? When you get really close to them, they get all pixelated. You just have to blow them up. Yes, it's remixed. This is Doom 2 Crushing Headache, remixed by the Oricolon? Oricolon? How would you say that? Oricolon?
How do you always pick the really difficult to pronounce names?
I have a knack for it. So, it's very atmospheric, kind of makes you feel like you're wandering through hallways on Mars or wherever you were, trying to hunt down alien demons. It's kind of like a zombie headbanger. So hopefully you enjoy somewhat. And so this has been Nick.
And this is Tim.
Adios.
So long.
Next time on Derailed Trains of Thought.
You know, if you read this book, you're going to turn into a witch.
But I'm a guy.
A male witch.
A wizard?
Wizard, those, yeah. You'll turn into those.
A warlock?
You're going to be very bad. It's sinful. Don't you understand? It's sinful.
Oh, I just like the plot.
Heathen.